Have you ever truly been alone? I mean really alone, where the silence presses in so tight that you can hear your own heartbeat thudding in your ears? That was the kind of silence that greeted me the first night I stepped foot into the old farmhouse. Nestled deep in the woods of rural Maine, I came here seeking peace, a retreat from the world after losing her. The memories in our city apartment were too much to bear, suffocating me in their familiarity. Every corner, every sound reminded me of her. How she'd laugh, how she'd hum while making breakfast, the way her voice would echo through the halls. That was gone now. All of it. All I had left was silence. The farmhouse was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts, my grief. But from the moment I arrived, something felt off. Air was thick with a kind of stillness that seemed unnatural, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That first night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, the sound of the wind rattling the old windows. I could feel the weight of the house around me, creaking of the wood like old bones settling in for the night. I told myself it was just an old building, that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But then, I heard it. A whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. My body stiffened, every nerve on edge as I strained to listen. It was so quiet. Breath of sound seemed to come from just outside my bedroom door. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it the wind? Trick of the mind? I forced myself to get up, to check. The hallway was empty, just a long stretch of darkness, with the faint glow of moonlight seeping through the windows. But that whisper, it lingered in the air, like an echo, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I shook my head, trying to clear it. It was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in this unfamiliar place. I returned to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard that soft, chilling whisper again. I lay there, paralyzed by an irrational fear, grew with each passing minute. What was it saying? Why did it feel like it was directed at me? As dawn broke, I finally succumbed to an uneasy sleep, but even in my dreams, that whisper followed me, growing louder, more insistent, as if it was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. When I awoke, I found myself gripped by an unsettling thought. What if I wasn't alone in this house after all? What if something was here with me, something that didn't want me to leave? The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease that had settled into my bones. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting a warm glow across the creaky wooden floors. It was almost enough to make me believe that the fear I felt last night was just a product of my grief, my exhausted mind playing tricks on me. Almost. I spent the day exploring the farmhouse, trying to familiarize myself with its old weathered charm. The house was larger than I'd realized, with long, narrow hallways and rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were adorned with faded, yellowing wallpaper that peeled at the edges, and the floors creaked with every step I took, as if protesting my presence. But it wasn't the decay or the age of the place that unnerved me. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that darted away just as I turned my head, doors that seemed to close on their own. Every time I tried to dismiss it, something else would happen that sent a shiver down my spine. Around noon, as I was sorting through some old boxes in the attic, I heard it again, the whisper. This time it was clearer, more distinct, and it wasn't just one voice. It was several, all murmuring at once, overlapping in a cacophony of breathy, disjointed phrases. My heart raced as I froze, straining to make out the words, but they slipped through my grasp like water through fingers. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the attic was empty. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that it pressed in on me from all sides. I felt the walls closing in, the air growing thick and heavy with a tension I couldn't explain. I had to get out of there. I stumbled down the stairs, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As I reached the bottom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the basement, which I had left firmly shut earlier that morning, was now wide open, revealing nothing but an impenetrable darkness beyond. Part of me wanted to slam it shut and bolt out of the house, to leave this place and never look back. But another part of me, a darker part, was drawn to it. compelled by a morbid curiosity to see what lay beyond the threshold. My feet moved of their own accord, slowly, cautiously, toward the basement door. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step taking me deeper into the cold, damp blackness. The air down there was different, stale, musty, with a faint, acrid smell that burned my nostrils. I fumbled for a light switch, but when I finally found it and flicked it on, the single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. At first glance, the basement seemed empty, just a few old shelves lined with dusty jars and rusted tools. But then I saw it, a small door at the far end of the room, half hidden behind a stack of rotting crates. It was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't noticed that door before. I took a step closer, and that's when I heard it again, the whisper, louder this time, more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side of that door was beckoning me, calling out to me in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob, cold sweat trickling down my spine. As I pushed the door open, the whispering stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that echoed in my ears. The small room beyond was bare, except for one thing, a dusty old trunk pushed against the far wall. My breath caught in my throat as I approached it, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave it alone. But I couldn't. With trembling hands, I unlatched the trunk and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were papers, letters, journals, all yellowed with age. As I reached in to pick one up, I felt something cold brush against my fingers. I yanked my hand back, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. I forced myself to focus on the papers, flipping through them with growing dread. They were written by the previous owner of the house, detailing his own descent into madness. His words were frantic, desperate, speaking of voices in the walls, of shadows that moved in the dark, presence that watched him, whispered to him, just as it was doing to me now. As I read the final entry, my blood turned to ice. The man spoke of the entity that lived in the house, how it fed on his fear, his sorrow, how it took the form of his dead wife to lure him deeper into its grasp. And then the last words, scrawled in a shaky, desperate hand. It wants me to stay. It wants me to join her. I dropped the papers, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows lengthening, deepening, until they swallowed the light completely. And then in the darkness I heard it. The whisper, clear as day, right next to my ear. James, join me. I bolted out of the basement, the echo of that whisper clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The rest of the day passed in a haze of fear and confusion, every corner of the house seeming to warp and twist under my gaze. It wasn't just the whisper anymore. It was the house itself, as if it was alive, as if it was watching me. I tried to focus, to distract myself by busying my hands, but everything felt wrong. The room seemed smaller, the walls closer together. My breath would catch in my throat at the slightest sound. Creak of a floorboard, the groan of the wind against the eaves. I told myself it was just the age of the place, the natural sounds of an old house settling. But deep down, I knew better. The day dragged on, the sun's slow descent in the sky filling me with a dread, couldn't explain. As night approached, the unease grew, curling tighter around my chest until I could hardly breathe. I avoided the mirrors, the windows, anything that might show me something I didn't want to see. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I could feel it. Presence, always there, always watching. By the time darkness fell, I was a nervous wreck, jumping at every sound, every flicker of movement. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to strike. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, my wife, standing at the foot of the bed, her face shrouded in shadow, her eyes, those eyes that had once been so full of life, now cold, empty, staring at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. But the room would be empty, the only sound my ragged breathing echoing in the silence. I told myself it was just a dream, that it wasn't real, but it felt real, too real. And then the nightmares began. I'd slip into a restless sleep, only to find myself back in the basement, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The air would grow thick, suffocating, as if something was squeezing the life out of me. I'd try to scream, but no sound would come out, my voice stolen by the shadows that writhed and twisted around me. And always I'd hear it, that whisper, growing louder, more insistent, until it drowned out everything else. "James, it's time." I'd wake up gasping, clawing at my throat as if I could tear the fear out of my chest. It didn't stop. Night after night, the same nightmare, the same suffocating darkness, the same cold voice whispering to me from the shadows. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the basement, the echo of that whisper clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Rest of the day passed in a haze of fear and confusion, every corner of the house seeming to warp and twist under my gaze. It wasn't just the whisper anymore. It was the house itself, as if it was alive, as if it was watching me. I tried to focus, to distract myself by busying my hands. Everything felt wrong. The room seemed smaller, the walls closer together. My breath would catch in my throat at the slightest sound. Creak of a floorboard, groan of the wind against the eaves. I told myself it was just the age of the place, the natural sounds of an old house settling. But deep down I knew better. The day dragged on. The sun's slow descent in the sky filling me with a dread I couldn't explain. As night approached, the unease grew, curling tighter around my chest until I could hardly breathe. I avoided the mirrors, the windows, anything that might show me something I didn't want to see. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I'd feel it, the presence, always there, always watching. By the time darkness fell, I was a nervous wreck, jumping at every sound, every flicker of movement. The whispers had stopped. The silence was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to strike. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, my wife, standing at the foot of the bed, her face shrouded in shadow, her eyes, those eyes that had once been so full of life, now cold, empty, staring at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The room would be empty, the only sound my ragged breathing echoing in the silence. I told myself it was just a dream, that it wasn't real. But it felt real, too real. And then the nightmares began. I'd slip into a restless sleep, only to find myself back in the basement, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The air would grow thick, suffocating, as if something was squeezing the life out of me. I tried to scream, but no sound would come out, my voice stolen by the shadows that writhed and twisted around me. And always I'd hear it, that whisper, growing louder, more insistent, until it drowned out everything else. "James, it's time." I'd wake up gasping, clawing at my throat as if I could tear the fear out of my chest. But it didn't stop. Night after night, the same nightmare, the same suffocating darkness, the same cold voice whispering to me from the shadows. I couldn't take it anymore. I became obsessed with the house, with the entity that lurked within its walls. I pored over the letters, journals, trying to make sense of what was happening to me. The more I read, the more I realized that I was not alone. Previous owner had gone through the same thing. He'd seen the same shadows, heard the same whispers. He'd lost his mind, just like I was losing mine. I started to see her during the day too. My wife, always at the edge of my vision, just out of reach. I'd turn and she'd be gone, leaving me to wonder if she'd ever been there at all. But I knew. I could feel her, just like I could feel the house watching me, feeding off my fear. I stopped leaving the house. I couldn't. Wouldn't let me. Every time I tried, something would stop me. Doors slamming shut, floorboards creaking under my feet as if the house was trying to trap me inside. And the whispers, they grew louder, more frequent, until they were all I could hear, drowning out my thoughts, my sanity. I tried to fight it, push the whispers away, but they were relentless, worming their way into my mind, twisting my memories, my grief, into something dark and sinister. I could feel myself slipping, losing grip on reality. There was nothing I could do. The house had me, wouldn't let me go. And then, one night, as I lay in bed, too afraid to sleep, I felt it. Cold breath on the back of my neck, the brush of icy fingers against my skin. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, my body paralyzed with fear. The room was dark, too dark, the shadows too deep, too thick. I knew she was there. I could feel her standing over me, watching me. My mouth went dry, my voice caught in my throat as I forced myself to turn to look, and there she was. My wife, standing by the bed, her face pale, her eyes hollow, filled with an unnatural darkness. She opened her mouth, and that voice, that terrible, cold voice, whispered my name. James, it's time to come home. I didn't sleep after that. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, her face twisted into something that wasn't hers. Something monstrous. The whispers didn't stop either. They were everywhere now, in the walls, in the floors, in my head. I couldn't escape them, no matter where I went in the house. They followed me, taunted me, wore me down until I was a shell of the man I once was. I knew I was losing my mind. But what scared me more was the thought that maybe I wasn't. Maybe this was real. Maybe the house had truly come alive, feeding off my fear, my grief, my despair. It felt like it wanted something from me, something I couldn't understand. But whatever it was growing stronger, more insistent, as if time was running out. The days blurred into nights, and I found myself drawn back to the basement, back to that small hidden room and the trunk full of secrets it held. I didn't want to go down there, but something pulled me, like an invisible thread winding tighter and tighter around my throat. I couldn't resist it. I had to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. The air was thick with dread as I descended the stairs, the shadows clinging to me like a second skin. The basement was colder than I remembered, the smell of damp earth and decay suffocating. My hand trembled as I reached for the light switch, but the bulb above flickered weakly before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I stood there, paralyzed by the blackness, the only sound, my ragged breathing, echoing off the walls. And then, out of that suffocating silence, came the whispers, louder than ever before. They surrounded me, pressing in from all sides, a chorus of voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. But one voice cut through the others, clear and cold, and full of malice. James, it's time to remember. The door to the hidden room creaked open by itself, revealing the trunk, sitting there in the dark like an open grave. I didn't want to go in, didn't want to open that trunk again, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me forward as if I were a puppet on strings. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears, my head, until I thought my skull would crack from the pressure. I dropped to my knees in front of the trunk, my hands shaking so violently I could barely lift the lid. But I did. I had to. And what I found inside made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the papers, the letters and journals. There were other things too. Things that had no business being there. Photographs of my wife, our wedding day, our first home, moments that should have been locked away in my own private memories, not buried in the basement of this godforsaken house. My breath caught in my throat as I sifted through the photos, my heart pounding in my chest. But it was the last photo that broke me. It was a picture of the farmhouse taken from the outside. But there, in the upstairs window, was a figure, my wife, staring out with those cold, dead eyes, as if she were waiting for me. The floor beneath me creaked, and I looked up, my blood turning to ice. There, in the doorway of the hidden room, stood my wife. But it wasn't her. It was the thing that had taken her form, the thing that had been haunting me, tormenting me. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of love or warmth. It was a smile of hunger, of triumph. James, you're home. I scrambled back, tripping over my own feet as I tried to get away. But it followed, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that sent waves of terror crashing over me. I could hear the whispers, louder now, more urgent, like a chant, a summoning. The walls of the basement seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker, until they were all I could see. And in that darkness, faces appeared. Twisted, tormented faces, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes full of despair. They reached for me, their hands cold and clammy, their fingers like claws digging into my flesh. I screamed, thrashing against their grip, but there was no escape. The house had me now, pulling me deeper into its madness, into its darkness. My wife, no, the thing that wore her face, knelt beside me, cold breath on my cheek, her dead eyes boring into mine. You can't leave, James, you're part of this now, just like the others. The others. I knew then that I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. This house, this entity, it had claimed countless lives before mine, feeding on their pain, their suffering, until there was nothing left of them but whispers in the dark. And now it had me. My strength was fading, the darkness closing in, swallowing me whole. But in that final moment, as the shadows consumed me, I heard a sound, a voice, faint and far away but familiar. It was my wife, my real wife. She was calling to me, begging me to fight, to escape. I reached out, desperate, clawing my way back to the light, back to her. But the house, the entity, it wouldn't let me go. Tightened its grip, pulling me down into the cold, dark earth, into the blackness where no light could ever reach. James, it's time to join her. And then, there was nothing but silence. I woke up on the cold, damp floor of the basement, my body trembling uncontrollably. My mind was a fog of terror and confusion. How long had I been down there? Hours? Days? Time had lost all meaning in the suffocating darkness of that cursed place. The air was thick with the stench of mold and decay, but beneath that there was something else. A metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat, the unmistakable scent of blood. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. Every muscle in my body ached, as if I'd been beaten from the inside out. The basement was dark, the light bulb above me, long since burned out, leaving me in a world of shadows and half-glimpsed horrors. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one echoing off the cold stone walls. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Her, watching me from the darkness. The air was thick with the tension of her presence, the weight of her gaze pressing down on me, threatening to crush what was left of my sanity. I stumbled toward the stairs, desperate to escape, put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. But as I reached the bottom step, the basement door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, trapping me in the darkness. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as the familiar sound of whispers filled the air once more. James, you can't run from me. The voice was everywhere, surrounding me, filling my ears, my head, my very soul. I turned, my back pressed against the wall as I scanned the darkness, searching for the source. But there was nothing. Just the shadows, shifting and writhing like they were alive. I knew I had to get out. I couldn't stay there, not with her so close, not with those whispers digging into my mind like knives. I bolted for the trunk, my hands fumbling for something, anything I could use to defend myself. But all I found were the old papers, the photographs. Memories of a life that seemed 1,000 years away. The whispers grew louder, more aggressive, the words twisting and distorting into a chorus of hate and malice. The air around me seemed to vibrate with a dark energy, and I could feel the walls closing in, the darkness pressing tighter and tighter until it was hard to breathe. And then I saw her. She stepped out of the shadows, her form flickering like a dying candle flame. It was my wife, not the woman I remembered. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those eyes that had once been so full of life, were now black voids, endless and empty. She smiled, but it was a twisted, cruel smile that made my blood run cold. You can't leave, James. You belong to me now. I ran for it, every muscle in my body screaming in protest, every instinct telling me to turn back, that this was a trap. But I couldn't stop. I had to reach that door. I had to escape. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, and collapsed against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was small, claustrophobic, with no windows and only that single door. But the light was warm, comforting, a stark contrast to the cold, dark hell I'd just escaped. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope, to believe that maybe I'd found a way out, a way to end this nightmare. But then I saw it, the trunk. The same trunk from the basement, sitting in the center of the room, its lid slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for me. And in that moment, I knew. There was no escape. The house had been toying with me, leading me deeper into its grasp. I was exactly where it wanted me. The whispers started again, louder than ever, a deafening roar that filled the room, filled my head. The walls began to close in, the shadows creeping across the floor, reaching for me, wrapping around my legs, my arms, pulling me toward the trunk. I fought, screamed, tried to resist, but it was no use. The shadows tightened their grip, dragging me across the floor, closer and closer to the open trunk. The light flickered, dimming, as if the very life was being sucked out of the room. I reached out, trying to grab onto something, anything to stop my descent into that cold, dark void. But there was nothing. Just the trunk, waiting, hungry. And then I was falling, the world around me swallowed by the blackness, the whispers fading into a cold, empty silence. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was her face. My wife, smiling that twisted, cruel smile. "James, welcome home." And then, in the midst of that storm of shadows, I felt something. Spark. Flicker of warmth in the cold. It was small, almost insignificant, but it was enough. I reached for it, grasping at it with everything I had, and suddenly the darkness began to recede, pulling back like a tide going out. The light grew stronger, pushing back the shadows, the cold, the whispers. I could feel the house shaking around me, its foundations cracking, the walls groaning under the strain. The entity was losing its grip, its power weakening as I reclaimed my own. I could see the trunk now, the source of the darkness, the anchor that held the entity to this world. It was still open, its lid quivering as if it were alive, as if it were trying to pull me back into its depth. But I wasn't going to let it. With a surge of strength I didn't know I had, I reached out and slammed the trunk shut. The impact echoed through the house like a gunshot, and for a moment, everything went still. The darkness shuddered, the whispers faltered, and then, with a final, agonized scream, the shadows dissolved, sucked back into the trunk as if they had never been there. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling, my mind reeling from the ordeal. The basement was silent now, the air still and heavy with the scent of earth and dust. But it was over. The darkness was gone. The entity was trapped, sealed away in the trunk, unable to harm me anymore. But as I lay there, gasping for breath, I realized something. The house was still there. The walls, the floor, the very air around me. It all felt wrong, tainted by the entity's presence. And though the darkness was gone, the house still held a part of it. A residue of the evil that had lived there for so long. I knew then that I couldn't stay. The house would never let me go, not completely. I had to leave, to get as far away from that place as I could, before it found a way to draw me back in. I staggered to my feet, my legs barely supporting me, and made my way up the stairs. The house groaned in protest, floorboards creaking under my weight, but I didn't look back. Couldn't. I reached the front door, my hand shaking as I turned the knob, and stepped out into the cold night air. The sky was clear, the stars bright and distant, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness I had just escaped. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was free, but as I walked away, the house behind me looming in the darkness, I knew it wasn't truly over. The whispers might be gone, the entity might be trapped, but the house was still alive. It was still watching, waiting, biding its time until it could find another victim. And as I left that cursed place behind, the wind carried a sound to my ears, a faint, distant whisper that sent chills down my spine. "James, you'll be back." Panic surged through me. I slammed my foot on the gas, but the car only shuddered in response, the engine choking on the air. The lights ahead began to blur, fading into the shadows as the darkness closed in around me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart froze. She was there, sitting in the back seat, her face pale and ghostly in the dim light. My wife, the thing that had taken her form, that had haunted me, tormented me. Her eyes were dark voids, her lips curled into that same cruel smile that had shattered my world. "James, it's time to come home," I screamed, wrenching the wheel to the side, but the car didn't respond. It slid to a stop, the headlights flickering out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the door, my hands shaking, desperate to get out, to run, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like the car itself had become part of the house, prison with no escape. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, filling the car with their maddening chorus. I could feel her breath on my neck, cold and damp, and when I turned, she was leaning closer, her face inches from mine, her black eyes staring into my soul. "You can't leave, James. You never could." The darkness around me pulsed, the whispers swelling to a deafening roar. I clawed at the door, at the window, at anything that could get me out, but it was useless. The car was part of the nightmare now, part of the house, and it wasn't going to let me go. And then, as the darkness closed in, I heard it. A soft click, the sound of the door unlocking. I didn't question it, I didn't think. I threw myself out of the car, stumbling into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get away, put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like claws, but I didn't stop. I could still hear the whispers, still feel her presence behind me, chasing me, pulling me back. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning with the effort. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't. Finally, I burst through the trees and into the town. The lights were bright, blinding after the darkness of the woods, and I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. People stared at me as they passed by, their faces full of concern and confusion, but I didn't care. I was out. I was safe. But as I looked back into the darkness of the woods, I saw it. Her pale face, her black eyes watching me from the shadows. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The house still had me, still held me in its grip. And no matter how far I ran, how much I tried to escape, it would always be there, waiting, watching, whispering, "James, you'll come back." They always do. And as I stumbled to my feet, the world around me spinning, I realized the terrible truth. I wasn't free. I never would be. The house had marked me, claimed me, and no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I would always carry a piece of it with me. The darkness was inside me now, part of me, and it would never let me go. The town didn't feel real. Bright lights, the bustling streets, the people going about their lives, it all seemed like a cruel joke, a mirage taunting me with the promise of safety that I knew wasn't there. I wandered through the streets, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner, waiting for her face to appear, for that cold, dead smile to pull me back into the nightmare. I tried to convince myself I was free. The house was miles away, trapped in the woods where it belonged, but the whisper followed me. Ghost in my ear that wouldn't let go. "James, I can't escape." I hadn't slept in days, too afraid to close my eyes, too terrified of what I'd see when the darkness came. The town began to blur around me, the edges of reality fraying as exhaustion set in. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the house's grip tightening, pulling me back, pulling me under. I checked into a motel on the outskirts of town, cheap, run-down place that reeked of stale cigarettes and mold. The walls were thin, the bed lumpy and hard, but it didn't matter. I wasn't planning to sleep. I just needed somewhere to think, to figure out what to do next. The moment I shut the door behind me, I felt it. She was in the room with me, though I couldn't see her. The air was thick with her presence, the scent of damp earth and decay filling my lungs. I backed away, my heart pounding. There was nowhere to go. The room was small, too small, the walls closing in, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped below the horizon. "James, why do you fight it? You know how this ends." I spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Just the empty room, the stained carpet, the peeling wallpaper. But I knew she was there. I could feel her, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the whisper, but it only grew louder, drilling into my skull, filling my mind with images of the house, of her standing in the doorway, smiling that terrible smile. I grabbed my keys, my coat, anything I could find, and bolted for the door. But as I reached for the knob, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I felt something cold brush against my neck. A soft, familiar touch that sent ice down my spine. "James, it's time to come home." I turned, and there she was, standing in the corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows. Her eyes were black voids, her skin pale as the moon, and when she smiled, I could see the darkness behind her teeth, the endless, hungry void that waited for me. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me, and fell to the floor. She moved closer, feet not quite touching the ground, her presence filling the room, filling me with a dread so deep, threatened to swallow me whole. "You can't run from me, James. You never could. You belong to the house now, to me." I shook my head, tears blurring my vision, but it was no use. The truth was there, staring me in the face, undeniable and cruel. I had never escaped. The house had never let me go. It was part of me now, a darkness that lived in my very soul, and no matter how far I ran, no matter what I did, it would always be there, waiting. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the trunk key still in my pocket. The trunk. It was the anchor, source of the house's power, the thing that had trapped all those souls, all those lives, including mine. But what could I do? The trunk was back in the house miles away in the woods, and even if I could find my way back, even if I could destroy it, would it really set me free? Or would I just be trading one kind of hell for another? The whispers surged, a torrent of voices screaming in my head, and I clutched at my skull, trying to drown them out. But they wouldn't stop. They wouldn't leave me alone. James, it's time. End this. I staggered to my feet, my mind a haze of fear and despair, and stumbled toward the bathroom. The mirror over the sink was cracked, the glass dirty and streaked, but it reflected my face, pale and hollow, my eyes wide with terror. And behind me, in the mirror, I saw her, smiling that twisted smile. I looked down at the sink, at the rusted razor blade that lay there, old and forgotten. My hand trembled as I picked it up, the cold metal biting into my fingers. The whispers were louder now, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else, everything but her voice. Do it, James. End this. Be with me. Ever. I stared at the razor, the edges sharp and gleaming in the dim light, and felt the darkness closing in, suffocating me, crushing the last remnants of my will. I was so tired of running, of fighting. I just wanted it to end. But then, in the silence that followed, I heard something else, my own voice, a whisper in the back of my mind, faint echo of the man I used to be. You don't have to do this. You can fight. You can win. I hesitated, the razor blade trembling in my hand, but the darkness was too strong, the whispers too loud. I could feel her behind me, her breath on my neck, hand on my shoulder. And I knew it was too late. The house had won. I was already lost. With a final shuddering breath, I pressed the razor to my wrist, the cold metal biting into my flesh, and closed my eye. The darkness surged, the whispers swelling into a crescendo, and as the blood began to flow, I felt a terrible peace settle over me. James, welcome home. And then there was nothing. The house would wait for another. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any